Hello, powerful people. Welcome back to the Power at Work blog. My name is Seth Harris. I'm a senior fellow at the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern University, and so glad to have you back here at the Power at Work blog. If it's your first visit, welcome. Good to see you. We've got a really interesting blogcast for you today. We're going to be talking about organizing and bargaining for the workers at cultural institutions, in particular at museums. And we'll be talking with four very powerful women from UAW Local 2110 in New York City about their experiences with organizing and bargaining for museum workers. They'll be led by Maida Rosenstein, who's the former president of Local 2110. She's now the organizing director. She's had experience organizing graduate students and other academic workers at NYU and Columbia University and other higher ed institutions. And she's organized at other not-for-profits and museums. Been a labor activist for more than 30 years, really knows a lot and shares a lot in this blogcast that we recorded last Thursday, August 17th. You're going to hear from Erika Wentworth. Erika works at the Whitney Museum of Art. She's a graphic designer in their in-house graphic design department. She was an important member of the union's bargaining committee when they tried to strike a deal with the Whitney management. They have 180 members in their union. So Erika talked a little bit about that in this interview. We have Karissa Francis, who loved the organizing so much that she's now become a full-time organizer for the UAW. She was in the visitor services department at the Whitney Museum along with Erika. They won the election, and she sort of got the fever and decided to stay as an organizer. And you'll hear from her as well. And then finally, last but not least, Jordan Barnes, who works at the Museum of Fine Arts, MFA, in Boston, Massachusetts, which is literally within the geographic boundaries of Northeastern University. She is a Northeastern University alum. She was also on the bargaining committee, and she is now a unit chair, sort of the chief steward of her union at MFA. And so really interesting. And it took 18 months for them to bargain a contract with MFA management. You like to think if you're a museum fan like I am, whatever city you're in, you go to museums, and you sort of think of them as these, sort of uplifting and educational and refined and sophisticated organizations. You'd like to think that the management of these organizations approach labor relations in a more enlightened way. If you think that, you're going to be really disappointed by what you're going to hear in this blogcast. It's just as much a struggle almost as it is with other employers. Maybe a little less. You'll have to sort of assess that for yourself. We have the same hopes and expectations with respect to higher education, let me just say, and sometimes it's true and other times it's not as true, as Maida mentioned during this blogcast. So you're in for a good one. I really hope you enjoy what we're bringing to you. Let me just talk about a couple of or three news stories that are out there in the labor news right now. There's a goodness gracious, there is a huge amount going on. And if you want to keep up with all of the stories that are out there, I really encourage you to subscribe to the blog, and we will send you the weekly download. The weekly download collects a couple of dozen articles, studies, opinion pieces, videos, other things that are on the web about worker organizing, collective action, strikes, bargaining, interesting inside stories about the labor movement from a variety of sources, not just the traditional mainstream media, but from a wide variety of sources, including from unions themselves. So I'm not going to be able to report to you on all of that stuff, but go to the weekly download. You can subscribe and get it sent to your inbox. You can also find it on the Power at Work blog. And we have a brand new design to the Power at Work blog right now. I encourage you to go and take a look at it. It's absolutely beautiful. It's really terrific. But if you go to the very top of the homepage, you can click on the weekly download and all the weekly downloads. I think we're up to number 30 right now. are there. So you can go back, and it's a collection of just a fantastically huge number of stories about what's going on in the labor movement. But there are three that I want to talk about very, very quickly with you here before we get to our excellent interview with the representatives from local UAW Local 2110. The first is that this week, our friends at the United Auto Workers are going to take a vote on whether or not to authorize a strike. The membership will vote on whether or not to authorize a strike against the big three U.S. auto manufacturers. My own view is that that strike authorization vote is going to overwhelmingly end in yes. My guess is 90% plus of the members will vote to authorize a strike. That doesn't mean that inevitably there will be a strike, but it means that the members are standing squarely behind their leadership and their bargaining committee and the demands that they're making at the bargaining table. You're going to see a lot of news coverage of that. But let me also say, I think we may be headed for a strike. With the UAW, it's not exactly clear whether they would just strike one of the automakers. My guess would be it would be Stellantis if they do, or they'll strike all three. Unclear right now. There's some distance between the company's positions and the union's positions. The union is pressing very, very hard to undo years and years of concession bargaining. I've written about concession bargaining coming to an end, both with the Teamsters UPS negotiations and these UAW negotiations. Go take a look at that on the Power at Work blog, but keep an eye out for these negotiations. The deadline, the contract expires middle of September. I think we might be headed for a strike in the auto industry. Hard to know how long it would last or what would be required in order to bring it to a close, but it's beginning to feel that way. Unclear, but I would say it leans in that direction. Another strike, the writers and actors strike, continues. The writers strike has been going on, for goodness sakes, for more than 110 days. 110 days. I think it's actually longer than that now. We have a great piece on the blog by my colleague Asia Sims, who found some video back from the last writers' strike in 2007 that gives you a little sense of some of the issues that they were dealing with then. They are strikingly similar to some of the issues that the parties are dealing with right now. I think you'll get a real kick out of it. So go look at Labor Artifact about the writers' strike from 2007. Fingers crossed that the writers will be able to get a deal. The studios have really mismanaged this labor relations process, really poorly managed, and that's one of the reasons we have two unions out on strike right now, and production has essentially ground to a halt, except for the independent films and television productions that are where the producers are not a part of the producer trade association, the AMPTP. But otherwise, most of the major television streaming other series are stopped because of this strike, and we may not see them again soon. A smaller story, but one that I'm immensely proud of. I take no credit for it. I had nothing to do with it except to talk about it in a prior blogcast and tweeting about it. But Cornell University, my alma mater, has announced that in 2025 they will no longer be doing business with Starbucks. And the reason that the university came to that conclusion is because the students on the Cornell campus in Ithaca, New York, vigorously protested that relationship. In essence, what they said to the university is, you cannot be a land-grant institution that carries out the best interests of the public and do business with a law-breaking union buster. And to her immense credit, her tremendous credit, President Martha Pollack of Cornell University agreed, and they're going to sever that relationship. And there is activism going on campuses all across the United States to get Starbucks off campus. My hope is that the success at Cornell will spark an even larger movement all across the U.S. to get Starbucks off every campus in every state in the United States. Not just public schools, not just land-grant institutions, but private schools as well, so that the schools can maintain some degree of integrity in the way they conduct business and the way in which they do business with their students and their faculty and their staff. Let me just say, this is not going to bring Starbucks to its knees. Maybe the Cornell contract, I don't know what it's worth. Maybe it's worth a few $1,000,000, maybe a few $100,000. Somewhere in between. Who knows? I don't know what it's worth. But it sends a potent message that you cannot get away with law breaking, you cannot get away with union busting, you cannot get away with firing workers because they support a union, and have nobody take action based on it. The law is limited in how it can punish employers who break the law. But those of us who are in the public who care about these issues can act. And shout out to Nick and Danielle and the other students on the Cornell campus for standing up for what's right. Starbucks closed all 3 unionized Starbucks in Ithaca, New York. And the students said, this is not going to stand. We're not going to allow this to happen. We're not going to allow Cornell to be an alternative to unionized Starbucks in College Town and downtown on the Commons and other places. And so they took this action. And I think I think Howard Schultz heard it loud and clear. Okay, those are the 3 stories I wanted to talk about with you. Now what I want you to do is listen closely to these 4 very powerful women from UAW Local 2110 as they talk about organizing and bargaining for workers in the museum sector. Enjoy. Well, first, let me say thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm a huge museum goer. I love museums. We travel all over the world to see them. So really delighted to have actual museum experts, cultural institution experts with us. But I want to talk about workers in cultural institutions and your work with them. So Maida, I want to start with you because you've been doing this for a good long time, former president of the union, now organizing director. So I want to start with this. My parents were school teachers. And back in the 1960s, when the public school teacher movement really began, there was some resistance from some teachers because they really wanted to view themselves as professionals, not as sort of frontline workers who would need a union, right? They weren't auto workers, they weren't steel workers. Why would we need a union? Now, obviously, the teachers successfully overcame that resistance. There may still be some pockets of resistance out there, but as a general matter, teachers now acknowledge the need for a union. Do you, in your organizing of museum workers and other cultural institution workers, have you encountered that same kind of resistance? Because museum organizing it's not a brand new phenomenon, but it's not something that's been around for a really long time. So is that part of why it's more of a new phenomenon, or is there something else going on?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons why museum workers have most recently been on the move and have been organizing. As you say, some museum workers have organized a long time ago. And I think it's definitely true of museum workers and other so-called white-collar and professional workers that there was an attempt to try to divide them and make people sort of divert people into thinking that their professional status or the fact that they worked in an office, meant that they shouldn't associate themselves with blue collar organizing or factory organizing. In museums, it used to be the case that people would openly say, well, you shouldn't work for a museum unless you were a trust fund baby. So this is really not about being a worker. This is about work for people who come from a very rich family and can afford to dabble in museums. That's changed, I think, very much, in the last 10 years. Museums have expanded a lot, workforces have expanded, and there aren't enough trust fund babies to go around to staff all the museums. And so, I don't think it carries the same kind of, that argument doesn't carry the same kind of weight with people. There are still, yeah,
No,
there are
go
still
ahead. No, please
divides.
go ahead.
I think there are still divides, we've seen museum management very directly try to appeal to people on the basis of they're, professionals that don't need the same things as other workers and, therefore should expect that the kinds of rights that you would negotiate in a union contract are not applicable or unnecessary. So
Yeah.
that goes on a
Yeah. So
lot.
I love the idea that having a trust fund would be viewed as a prerequisite for working in a museum rather
Yeah.
than, say, having knowledge of art or having a degree in art history or in some other relevant
Yeah.
field. That's a surprising proposition, maybe not all that persuasive. So let me get into more specifics. And Karissa, let me come to you on this. Um, uh, were you there when the Whitney, or you work at the Whitney for those who might not know that, one of a great museum in New York City. So were you there when they organized the union at the Whitney, and what did that look like? What were the conversations like with you and your coworkers about, should we have a union? Why do we need a union? What will it mean to have a union? Is that the way that we really want to be? What was that experience like?
Yes. So I was actually one of the first to organize the Whitney. It really started in visitor services, which is where I worked, and then kind of spread from there. The interesting thing about it is, and the great thing about the Whitney is that people really like each other there, which is not required for organizing, but it certainly helps. And so conversations about organizing and about our working conditions were already kind of happening. And then with the pandemic, it really kind of escalated from there. And I think we were kind of part of that crop of museums that were really affected by the pandemic and affected by a lot of the decisions that were being made during the pandemic. And just wanting to have a bigger voice and to have, say over a lot of the policies that were being put in place and changed suddenly, and, day-to-day working conditions at the Whitney. So I would say it wasn't, it's work. It's not, I will not, undermine the work that, myself and my colleagues really put into organizing at the Whitney. But it was also, it wasn't as difficult as maybe it could have been, given that people already had pretty good relationships with each other.
So I want to ask you about a particular issue, and I'm eager to get Jordan and Erika, and also Maida, if you'd like to jump in on this. So if I understand it correctly, when you organize a union, and particularly in the Whitney, but I think in the other institutions, you do what's called wall-to-wall organizing, right? You don't organize just the professional staff, just the maintenance staff, just the cafeteria workers. If I've got, tell me if I've got this wrong, but as I've got it, you organize everybody in the institution into one union. Now, that first of all, do I have that right? And second of all, if I do have that right, I think I learned that from Maida. What does that do to the organizing conversation? And I'm going to later on get to what it does to the bargaining conversation. But how do the professionals feel about being in a unit with the blue collar workers? How do the blue collar workers feel about being in a unit with a bunch of professional workers? And how did it affect the conversations around organizing?
Yeah, I mean, from the perspective, I worked in front of house when I worked at the Whitney. So, we are very siloed in a way, and there was a sense of divide. And I think it's very empowering actually to unionize and talk to people in all these other different departments, because learn things across departments that you wouldn't have otherwise. And a lot of the issues that are in one department are true for another, just in a different way, or, it looks slightly different. And a lot of issues that we were having in front of house, people, in curatorial or development or digital had no idea that we were going through. So it's really empowering, and it gives a much stronger sense of unity, I think, when you're able to bridge across department and job type. So I think it's wonderful, of course.
Right,
Yeah,
right. And go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna sort of echo the same thing. Like, I really think it strengthens, organizing as a whole when there's like many different kinds of professionals and different types of people within one unit. I work in graphic design, so I'm more on the office side, but I actually think like not only does it strengthen the organizing, but it kind of like when you're working towards like a common goal all as one union, it actually also like strengthens your work as well. I think it like there's sort of like, I don't know, relationships that like I have with front of house employees that I maybe wouldn't have had if it weren't for having this like wall-to-wall unit, which is
Well,
really important.
I want to pick up on that, Erika, because you were on the bargaining committee. Am I right? Also
Yeah.
at the Whitney.
Yes.
You also work at the Whitney. And so let's talk a little bit about how you bargain for a unit that includes a very diverse group of workers that have a lot of different interests and that are at very different pay scales. I assume there's not a single pay scale at the Whitney for graphic designers and for cafeteria staff and for the curators. So, first of all, what was the process within the union of figuring out what the bargaining priorities are? And what was it like going to management and bargaining on behalf of a wide variety of folks who presumably had some diverse concerns?
Well, I mean, I think people have diverse concerns, but there's also like many things that like even if we're on sort of different pay scales or realities, like the issue of being paid fairly for your work is sort of like universal. And like I don't know, there's like many things like that. There's also like the issue of abuse of temporary employees, and that's a front of house and a back of house issue. Like there are many actual commonalities that are, you know, maybe have different nuances depending on what area of the museum you work in, but there's also like a very firm common ground of like, yeah, it's like that's a problem for you, that's a problem for me too. Maybe Karissa, you were in the bargaining game much longer than me, so maybe you could speak to that even more.
Yeah, I mean, we just talk to each other. You know, we surveyed people, we asked people, what are the issues? What do you care about? What's important to you? I mean, you can, you know, bring whatever you want from your own personal perspective, but it's so much stronger when you just literally just have a conversation. Like, what's going on? What is your job? What do you do day to day? Like, it gives you a good sense of where people are and where people want to go. And people have been so underpaid in the arts field specifically that it's like everyone needs a boost up regardless of where you fall into the museum. And you know, there's a lot, like Erika said, of commonalities and universalities, but just knowing what's going on in the workplace, what people are doing, what they feel like, what issues they're having, just talking to them. We surveyed people. It was a lot of on the ground organizing and just face to face conversations with people and following up with people and talking to people and finding out what's going on. I think is
well, so organizing for bargaining, it sounds like.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. Bargaining is just more intense, more directed organizing about very specific issues. I was on the bargaining committee for the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. And actually, in our election, there was a question on our ballot whether or not professionals wanted to be in a separate union. So that was something we had to organize about pre-election. And then once we were in those diverse concerns, you're also not only organizing to find out what people need, you are organizing to demonstrate to people that they need to have solidarity with their coworkers who have different concerns than them, and making sure you bridge that between all the different groups that you're representing.
All right, so let me stay with you, Jordan. Let me just say, we're always thrilled on the Power at Work blog to lift up Northeastern alums. And if I have it correct, you are an alumnus of Northeastern. Actually, if you're working at MFA, you didn't go very far from Northeastern. It's actually sort of within that broad Northeastern complex, right?
Oh, yes. I started at Simmons, and then I went to Northeastern, and then I went to the MFA. So I did not move far.
You did not move far. You didn't even have to change apartments. How about that? That's great. But I want to ask you about why it is folks organized a union. Was there a triggering event? Was there some conflict with the employer? Was it the pandemic that caused folks to do it? Was it earlier than that? What is it that caused folks to all of a sudden because the MFA is not a new institution. It's been around for a good long time. What is it that caused folks to wake up one day or wake up several weeks and say, you know what, we really need a union in this workplace?
Yeah, so I think Karissa mentioned that the union at the Whitney, like the nucleus of it, really came out of visitor services. At the MFA Boston, it came out of conservation. The staff there had been for years dealing with a very unfair, unequitable pay situation where they were being paid between 15 and 40% less than their peers across the industry. That is, it went from letters to management, letters to the board, and eventually the drive to unionize really got steam at the end of 2019. And by the time spring, summer 2020 came around and the pandemic started, there was a lot of support for it. What really was the flashpoint at that moment from bringing people interested to it to actually getting to an election and getting people to sign membership cards was the fact that the MFA was not very effective at communicating during the pandemic. There were a lot of early retirements, a lot of layoffs, a lot of furloughs. People went a very long time without a raise in pay on already low pay. And I think that combined with more specific departmental concerns really sort of lit a fire to have the election.
So I want to ask you, what was the vote? Well, I just want to ask one quick question, Maida, and I'm going to let you jump in. What was the vote at MFA in the union election?
We won the union. It was somewhere between 92 and 95%, right around there.
And what was it, Karissa and Erika? What was it at the Whitney?
It's about 98%.
I don't even know.
Yeah, it was high.
It was very high.
98%. That is really something. I'm sorry, Maida, I interrupted you. Jump in.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that I think, that whole question of what goes back to why museum workers are organizing. While, I think there are specifics about the MFA and specifics about the Whitney, there also are a lot of common issues. And the organizing really took off before the pandemic. I think was really the outgrowth of massive wage inequality that played out, obviously not only in the bigger picture, but played out in museums as well. I mean, museums expanded a lot. Their staff grew, their programs grew. They did building expansions, etc. Their directors and leadership salaries increased a lot. Their billionaire boards became, very prominent. And at the same time, the hidden secret was that pay was really low for almost all of the staff of museums. And in some instances, not just low, but very partial, part-time workers, seasonal workers, on-call workers, et cetera. And I think so there was a brewing thing of growing staff with low salaries, really wanting, starting to take on museums. The MFA, I remember, was very much inspired. I think it sparked because they heard about the New Museum organizing in New York. And the New Museum is a relatively small institution, but there was national press on the organizing, and museum workers in other places paid attention to this. And, that is how I, and there started to be organizing it sparked organizing in other institutions. In particular, I think at the Brooklyn Museum, people were organizing, and it's also an industry that is not a huge industry, and people talk to each other. And so people knew about the organizing in different places, and it inspired them, and they had many internal reasons to organize as well.
Yeah, it sounds like the Starbucks effect. You had 3 stores in Buffalo. You had union elections. I believe they won 2 of the 3 elections there. And then organically, organizing spread all across the United States, and now there are 300 organized stores. It sounds like something similar happened in your industry. People heard about union organizing. They all of a sudden said, hey, wait a minute, I want one of those. How do I get one of those? We have issues too. But Maida, I want
Right.
to talk to you about the employers a little bit.
Sure.
Because museums are not typical employers in American culture, right? They're not for-profit institutions. They're not usually run by MBA leadership who've been trained in how to maximize profit, and they're different. They're
Not
different
yet.
animals. Not yet. So how did they react when the unions started organizing? Was the quality, because you've organized in a number of different industries,
Right.
was the quality of their response in any way different, or was it just typical employer, you're not going to have a union here kind of response?
Well, I think it was very, it varied. And I think the timing and the location had a big impact. When we organized at the new museum, they ran a anti-union campaign. They hired an outside consultant, from Kentucky actually, and did this sort of classic anti-union campaign. And it really didn't work on people. And other museums sort of saw that that this didn't work, and it sort of failed miserably. And then as well, I think when the pandemic hit, a lot of the museums in New York they didn't want to have anti-union campaigns. And so they allowed elections to go forward without as much problem. Some of them, and still are, decided they were going to fight their fights at the bargaining table and be very difficult there. Once you get out of New York, though, because there's very high union density, it's worse for unions outside of New York, period. So the MFA did run an anti-union campaign during the election. It wasn't a very effective one, and it wasn't super heavy-handed for, in terms of the range of campaigns. But they did, they used, they tried to appeal to elitism. They tried to say you lose your flexibility. They did run that campaign. They were difficult to bargain with. At the Portland Museum of Art in Maine, they ran a full-scale anti-union campaign. They were really union busters. So I think there was some variation, and I think the union density in New York helped us in New York. The timing of the pandemic also, I think, made it difficult. Museums were under such siege during the pandemic themselves that a lot of them were not in a position to take on fights with workers, with their own workers. And there was a moment too where, it seemed like workers were going to have more power. Whether that continues, I think employers will, try to figure out ways to regain their control over the situation. And certainly these museums are not easy to bargain with. I mean, all of these first contracts have taken a long time. The Whitney, it took us over a year to get a contract. It was extremely difficult. The same, the same with the MFA. So they're definitely not pushovers.
Yeah. So Erika, I want to talk about the bargaining a little bit. Getting a first union contract in almost any industry is extremely difficult, but your industry is different because it's largely, unless it's a publicly owned institution, right? Unless it's a public museum or a public cultural institution, their funding largely comes from philanthropy, from corporate grant making, from other sources. Did that funding reality play into bargaining? Was it part of the strategy of the employer to say, well, we don't have it, Our money is being given to buy this piece of work or to build this building, and we just don't have money for salaries. How did that background funding issue play into the discussions that you participated in?
I don't know if it was necessarily like brought to the table with like such specificity of like we can't put more money into salaries because we have like X thing. I think there was like definitely some amount of like, well, we have the money we have to figure out the budget. The budget is the budget. But it was never really framed like specifically in that way. I don't know, Maida or Karissa, you have any insights on that as well?
I think it was framed.
I didn't feel like it was so specific, but yeah.
I've been in negotiations where, that certainly the question of priority for resources has been an issue. I think it was true at the MFA, Jordan, wasn't it? That definitely, during the bargaining that the issue, of like the competing needs issue came up. And it's actually been, I think, one of the sort of swelling, motivations for people to organize, for staff to organize, is the fact that no resources have been put into staff. I know in particular at the MFA, I would hear that people, people on our committee would speak to the fact that the staff was needed to be considered as valuable, if not more valuable, than the collection itself. I think, in that sense, museums did try to pit like the needs of employees against the needs of the collection or of the art.
And so we've attended to a small technical difficulty, and I want to come back to Jordan with a question about what life is like at MFA now, after the organizing drive, after the bargaining. You were in a struggle with management about organizing. Obviously, you were in a struggle with management around bargaining. All hugs and kisses now around MFA between management and union members, or are there still tensions? Is there still conflict? Are there still unresolved issues?
There's definitely still tensions, but we're moving towards resolving some of them. I think one of the big things is that it is a first contract. So there were a number of issues during organizing and bargaining that we just couldn't solve in the first contract. We spent 4 months getting a bulletin board language in the contract, so we weren't able to get everything we wanted. And I do keep a list of items for the next contract, and we'll see what we can get the next time around. But for the things that are in the contract, there are things that we constantly struggle with over interpretations of the contract or applying them, recognition, getting new titles included in the unit. But I think some other things, really positive things, have come out. People can have union representation with them when they face a difficult HR meeting or a difficult meeting with a manager. There are a number of people who have gotten temporary pay increases that we've never even had to file a grievance over, which is wonderful. But I think the main issue that still sticks around, that overlays everything, all the work we do, is the glacial slowness with which the museum moves. Any decision, any response to us is agonizingly slow.
Now, is that labor management relations, or is that just not-for-profit bureaucracy, do you think?
I think it's a little bit of both, right?
Both.
Yeah, it's not unique to the union at the MFA. It happens in other areas as well. But it is, when you take 8 weeks to get a response on something that is more urgent for your member, that they need a reply on, it's tough.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Whitney. What about the Whitney? Are there still lingering tensions from the bargaining, from the organizing? Are you still are you and management still sort of circling each other, Karissa, or is it fallen into a more normal rhythm, do you think?
Yeah, I think there's, a culture shift that has to be had in terms of like communication and how the processes that they're used to doing and the way that they're used to, just doing things with no recourse. It's an adjustment for sure, not just for management, but like for employees as well, for their first instinct to come to the union and as opposed to, HR. Like it's a big shift, but it doesn't feel like anything that is insurmountable. I mean, as Jordan said, a lot of things you're not going to get in a first contract, so you build up for the next one.
Yeah. Erika, what's been your experience at the Whitney with the it's a new marriage. It may be a shotgun marriage, but it's a marriage.
Yeah, I would say I mean I agree with everything Karissa just said, and then I guess in addition to that, like, for better or for worse, there's a bit of a different cast of characters from when we were bargaining. Both on the membership side and the management side. So it's like,
Explain that. Explain what you mean by that.
well, we have a different head of human resources. So that's like a major difference. And also, museum worker like jobs are pretty high turnover even still. I mean, our contract is very new. Hopefully that sort of mitigates that, because we want people to stay a long time. But yeah, so there's just a lot of new people in the mix. And I actually think, I mean, in some ways it's good. Like there isn't like any bitterness from like many, over a year of bargaining on that. Like there's, I think, a reduced amount of like, not that tension isn't still there. It's sort of just like the nature of management and employee kind of relationships. But yeah, there's just like new people involved. So it's a lot of just teaching people like, hey, you can ask for help with that, or, this part of the contract protects you from what's going on. And like, some people came very shortly before our contract was ratified or even after. And so just like getting people up to speed, I feel like is actually like the greatest hurdle. It's like the most amount of work right now is just like training people on the contract.
Yeah. So talk
Which
about
is
that a little
okay.
bit.
It's no problem.
Yeah, Erika, I
Especially
want to
the
talk with you about
management.
that.
Especially the management.
Training management.
Yeah.
I assume that's not the union's responsibility. I assume that's HR and
It's our
LR's
burden.
responsibility. But
It's our
yeah.
It's our
burden.
burden.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Is because there is turnover in the museum world.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a common experience, not just in your industry, but in a lot of industries where, particularly, it's more common in the retail industry and some others. Um, so, some of the workers were there when the fight happened, and some of them came sort of after the fight had been won. And how do you incorporate the new members into the unit? How do you make them feel comfortable that the decisions that have been made on their behalf are good decisions for them and that they're going to be full members of the union and have a full
Mm-hmm.
voice in the union? And do you worry that, I mean, 98% and 92%, those are pretty impressive vote totals. Do you worry that you're going to start to lose support as that turnover continues? Erika, let me start with you, and then Jordan, I want to get your reaction, and Maida, if you have thoughts. So, Erika.
Honestly, of course there's always people who are reluctant about unions, but it doesn't worry me because, I mean, if you talk to someone for like 15 minutes about like, here's why we formed a union, here's why we went, you know, we fought for this contract. Like the basis of that is like, we're a wall-to-wall unit. We decided to have this because of this notion of just like, we work at the same place and like, I'm going to have your back and you're going to have my back. And like, that is very appealing to people. And just like the stability of like knowing like we're going to get raises every X number of months and it's going to be this amount is actually like, I think people like that because most employers don't have that. And so like, just feeling like they're protected by something, like feels good and like included in something. Like it's kind of like fun and cool to be in a union too, like aside from like all the obvious like worker protections.
I think
Like it just
Erica just gave us the lift quote for this blogcast, and that is, "It is fun and cool to be in a union."
it
I think that
is.
actually happens to be true, and we're
Yeah.
finding that out. We're absolutely
Mhm.
finding that out. Jordan, what about an MFA? Do you have the same kind of turnover, and how do you? I guess the phrase that the corporate world would use. How do you onboard the new members, and do you worry that you're going to start losing support if the turnover continues?
So I agree with Erica. I don't think we're going to lose support, but it definitely takes like strategy and intention to like communicate with all of these new members. The turnover is highest in very specific departments at the MFA. Member and visitor services and retail being two of them, along with a couple other smaller departments. We try and have very strong leaders in those departments who are around or who work with those departments quite often, who can be like, "Hey, you're new. Have you heard about the union yet? Come have a coffee with me. Let me tell you how great it is. Here's your sign up link," and like all of that. I think the other piece of that is that the MFA, one of the reasons we organize and something that was really unifying for our unit, is that the MFA had a very much a lack of communication. So a lot of people came to the union to try and get information during furlough, during COVID, during return to work, and all of these things that came out of the pandemic. So our delegate group has been very intentional. We are here. Here's our phone number. Here's our email. You can find us at open office hours or drop in lunches. This is where my office is. Like, reach out to me anytime. And people have been doing that, even for issues that the union cannot really cover. But I think it really helps to show that we are here for anything they have. And we're just very open if it's not something we can help with, but only provide advice on. So I don't think the union support is going anywhere anytime soon. People really value having those resources in a workplace and knowing that there's always someone to turn to.
Yeah. So, Karissa, let's talk about the future a little bit. You're now full time working for the local as an organizer, if I have that right. And there's, Lord knows, there's no city on earth that has more cultural institutions than the greatest city on earth, New York City. So, my guess is you've got a lot of places to organize. So, tell us how it's going. I'm not going to ask you to disclose any confidences if you have some organizing campaigns that are not yet public, but give us a sense of how's it going? What's the reaction been? Are people pointing to the Whitney, tell me if I'm wrong here, but the Guggenheim just got a nice
We just
pay
settled.
increase out of collective bargaining. Tell us about some of the conversations that you're having with other cultural institutions in New York City.
Yeah, I mean, I am full time. I caught the organizing bug. I think lots of people do, and I hope they continue to. I mean, as Erica put wonderfully, unions are cool and fun to be in. So I'm optimistic, but I'm always optimistic about organizing because I think it's really important. And once people learn what they are, they're on board. I mean, once you understand, what unions do and what they can do and, how they can benefit not just you, but everyone around you, I think, it's kind of a no-brainer to me, and I want to put out into the universe and into the world that it just keeps going and people, push for themselves and advocate for themselves and others and have solidarity and become aware of the things around them. We do live in this, wonderful time where we have access to all these things, and we do live in this wonderful city with all these institutions, and there are people and power in the people, and it's so important to boost it up. I care so much about art and art institutions, and I want everyone and everything to constantly be improving and getting better and expanding. So I feel very great about it, and I hope others do as well. And I hope they think about it and consider it and don't feel hopeless or stalled in any way.
All right, so I'm going to put you on the spot, but you can take yourself off the spot if you want. We're not very tough here at the Power Work blog. You want to make a prediction about how many more unions will be organized in museums before the end of 2023 in New York City?
Yeah.
I won't make you do a national guess. No,
We don't want to make that prediction. No.
Okay,
We
no
don't want to make
predictions.
that prediction.
All right, Maida. So I'm going to ask you something a little bit harder then. So as you said, New York City is New York City. It is one of the most heavily unionized jurisdictions in the United States. New York State is one of the top 3 states in union density. I believe California and Hawaii are the other 2. I may be wrong about that. I haven't looked recently, but it's certainly near the top. And so people who are watching this are potentially saying, oh, sure, anybody could organize a bunch of lefty museum workers in New York City, for goodness sakes. That's the easiest job on earth. Carissa just walks in, signs the card, she's done, goes off and has drinks. But here's the real, if only, right. So here's the real question. What about outside New York City? Now, I know there's been successful organizing, I believe, at the Art Institute in Chicago and also the Art Institute School in Chicago. And you hear about it in a few other places. But can we expect to see the same kind of success in museum organizing, whether it's the UAW, our friends at AFSCME also do a lot of organizing in public cultural institutions? Can we expect to see the same kind of success in Nebraska, in Alabama, in Texas, in Arizona, in Colorado? Let's pick a purple state. Or is this really a big city, blue city phenomenon, do you think?
Well, it's a really good question, and we'll see whether there's anything that happens in any of the red states or the purple states around this. Even in those circumstances, museums do tend to be in urban areas where there is potentially, it is potentially easier to organize because it's a more liberal thing. But I certainly would like to see that, see that happening. And it's a legitimate thing to say that, to point out that museum workers are organizing often in union dense areas. I have to say Boston is tougher than New York, and the MFA people, because the union density is lower, and we have been organizing in Massachusetts and Connecticut as well. Those are, at least Massachusetts is not as union dense as New York. But the Nebraska's out of Local 2110's jurisdiction, so I don't know a lot about it and can't really speak to it. But I would love to see, I would love to see organizing in some of the red states in museums, because perhaps it is an entree into more organizing. Certainly, museum workers are probably, as a group, more liberal than in some other workplaces. Not completely, but probably more so.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll put you on the spot with a sort of yes/no question or an up/down question. Is it harder to organize in the museum sector or in the higher education sector?
Well, I think the museum sector is the most of the organizing that's been going on in higher ed more recently is academic workers, grad students, some adjuncts, although not as many as I'd like to see, and a little bit of postdoc and faculty organizing. And I think the workforce in museums, while the demographic is similar, people do take jobs in museums to earn a living and potentially to have a career. And I think that does make it more challenging. Professionals who are in museums hope to stay there, promote up, and advance. And so their view of the workplace, I think, is a little bit different. I I think in some of the university organizing, I think that's going on now, may, the challenges are a little different than they would be in museums.
Yeah, because we're seeing a wave of success in higher education. I mean, it's really quite impressive. There's a lot of battles
But
going
it's
on, big battles going on, but boy, oh boy, huge units being organized all across the United States.
of
Grad students, but not just grad students, adjuncts, as you said, but also faculty in some places where they're able to organize. So it
yes,
would be
in
nice to see the
some,
museums.
yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I would say that the museum counterparts really in universities, though, are not organizing in universities. Some clerical workers have organized, and it's been very tough. That's the sector I came out of. I was a clerical worker at Columbia when we organized. But administrative staff in universities are not moving in that way. So I think the counterpart employees in universities are not organizing, at the same rate. And I would just say there's some significant differences, I think, between graduate student and academic organizing and organizing among administrative, professional, or front-facing workers.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank all four of these powerful women for being with us today to talk about museum organizing. You were terrific, and we really got some insights into what life is like behind the scenes and in front of the scenes in museums. And wish you a lot of success, Karissa, with your organizing, Erika, with the campaign that was announced. Let me just say, while we were off camera, but I don't hear you agreeing to actually run for the position that Maida nominated you for, and Jordan with your leadership at the MFA. And we look forward to, we're going to, since we're at Northeastern, we're going to drop by and see you. So
Great.
thanks a lot for being with us. Great conversation. Appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Really interesting learning about this sector that's been around for decades and decades and decades and decades, but hasn't been organized. And now it's organizing. I think that's terrific. I hope it's going to organize all across the United States. Hey, thanks for hanging around. Let me just urge you to connect with us. You can subscribe on the blog. You're here on the blog. You can subscribe just by clicking, giving us your email address, and we'll send you the weekly download. We'll send you a weekly newsletter. We'll keep you updated on what we're posting on the blog. There's a lot of terrific material on the blog right now. I just posted something new about the Labor Department's new prevailing wage Davis-Bacon regulations. I analyzed them in the context of worker power. So go take a look at that, but subscribe to the blog. But you can also connect with us on, I guess we're going to call it X now. Are we calling it X, or are we still calling it the artist formerly known as Twitter? Connect with us there. Connect with us on Threads. Connect with us by following our page on LinkedIn, the Power at Work page. On X/Twitter, it's at Power at Work blog. On Threads, it's at Power at Work blog. On Instagram, it's at Power at Work blog. On LinkedIn, just search for the Power at Work page and follow us there. You can also follow us on Facebook. We're on all of those platforms. We're really eager to connect with you, to hear from you. Send us a direct message through one of those channels. But most important, subscribe. Thanks a lot. We've got a bunch of great blogcasts coming up soon. Check back here to the blog or subscribe so that you can keep updated on what's coming. We have some, I promise you, we have some that you're absolutely not going to want to miss as we come into the lead up to Labor Day. So please stay close to us, stay connected to us. Look forward to seeing you again on the blog very soon.